Adventure the First of the Adventures of a Brownie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of a Brownie, as Told to My Child, by Miss Mulock. Adventure the First, Brownie and the Cook. There once was a little brownie who lived— where do you think he lived? In a coal cellar. Now, a coal cellar may seem a most curious place to choose to live in, but then a brownie is a curious creature, a fairy, and yet not one of that sort of fairies who fly about on gossamer wings and dance in the moonlight and so on. He never dances, and as to wings, what use would they be to him in a coal cellar? He is a sober, stay-at-home household elf. Nothing much to look at, even if you did see him, which you are not likely to do. Only a little man about a foot high, all dressed in brown, with a brown face and hands, and a brown peaked cap, just the color of a brown mouse. And, like a mouse, he hides in corners, especially kitchen corners, and only comes out after dark when nobody is about, and so sometimes people call him Mr. Nobody. I said you were not likely to see him. I never did, certainly, and never knew anybody that did, but still, if you were to go into Devonshire, you would hear many funny stories about brownies in general, and so I may as well tell you the adventures of this particular brownie, who belonged to a family there, which family he had followed from house to house most faithfully for years and years. A good many people had heard him, or supposed they had, when there were extraordinary noises about the house, noises which must have come from a mouse or a rat, or a brownie. But nobody had ever seen him, except the children, the 3 little boys and 3 little girls, who declared he often came to play with them when they were alone, and was the nicest companion in the world, though he was such an old man, hundreds of years old. He was full of fun and mischief, and up to all sorts of tricks, but he never did anybody any harm unless they deserved it. Brownie was supposed to live under one particular coal in the darkest corner of the cellar, which was never allowed to be disturbed. Why he had chosen it nobody knew, and how he lived there nobody knew either, nor what he lived upon, except that, ever since the family could remember, there had always been a bowl of milk put behind the coal cellar door for the brownie's supper. Perhaps he drank it, perhaps he didn't. Anyhow, the bowl was always found empty the next morning. The old cook, who had lived all her life in the family, had never once forgotten to give Brownie his supper. But at last she died, and a young cook came in her stead, who was very apt to forget everything. She was also both careless and lazy, and disliked taking the trouble to put a bowl of milk in the same place every night for Mr. Nobody. She didn't believe in brownies, she said. She had never seen one, and seeing's believing. So she laughed at the other servants, who looked very grave, and put the bowl of milk in its place as often as they could without saying much about it. But once, when Brownie woke up at his usual hour for rising, 10 o'clock at night, and looked round in search of his supper, which was in fact his breakfast, he found nothing there. At first he could not imagine such neglect, and went smelling and smelling about for his bowl of milk. It was not always placed in the same corner now, but in vain. "This will never do," said he, and being extremely hungry, he began running about the coal cellar to see what he could find. His eyes were as useful in the dark as in the light, like a pussy-cat's, but there was nothing to be seen, not even a potato paring, or a dry crust, or a well-gnawed bone, such as Tiny the terrier sometimes brought into the coal cellar and left on the floor. Nothing, in short, but heaps of coal and coal dust, and even a brownie cannot eat that, you know. "Can't stand this. Quite impossible," said the brownie, tightening his belt to make his poor little inside feel less empty. He had been asleep so long, about a week, I believe, as was his habit when there was nothing to do, that he seemed ready to eat his own head, or his boots, or anything. "What's to be done? Since nobody brings my supper, I must go and fetch it." He spoke quickly, for he always thought quickly, and made up his mind in a minute. To be sure, it was a very little mind, like his little body, but he did the best he could with it, and was not a bad sort of fellow after all. In the house he had never done any harm, and often some good, for he frightened away all the rats, mice, and black beetles. Not the crickets. He liked them, as the old cook had done. She said they were such cheerful creatures, and always brought luck to the house. But the young cook could not bear them, and used to pour boiling water down their holes and set basins of beer for them with little wooden bridges up to the rim, that they might walk up, tumble in, and be drowned. So there was not even a cricket singing in the silent house when Brownie put his head out of his coal-cellar door, which, to his surprise, he found open. Old Cook used to lock it every night, but the young cook had left that key, and the kitchen and the pantry keys too, all dangling in the lock, so that any thief might have got in, and wandered all over the house without being found out. "Hurrah! There's luck!" cried Brownie, tossing his cap up in the air and bounding right through the scullery into the kitchen. It was quite empty, but there was a good fire burning itself out, just for its own amusement, and the remains of a capital supper spread on the table, enough for 6 people being left still. Would you like to know what there was? Devonshire cream, of course, and part of a large dish of junket, which is something like curds and whey. Lots of bread and butter and cheese, and half-apple pudding. Also a great jug of cider and another of milk, and several half-full glasses, and no end of dirty plates, knives, and forks. All were scattered about the table in the most untidy fashion, just as the servants had risen from their supper without thinking to put anything away. Brownie screwed up his little old face and turned up his button of a nose and gave a long whistle. You might not believe it, seeing he lived in a coal-cellar, but really he liked tidiness, and always played his pranks upon disorderly or slovenly folk. "Whew!" said he, "here's a chance! What a supper I'll get now!" And he jumped onto a chair and thence to the table, but so quietly that the large black cat with 4 white paws called Muff, because she was so fat and soft and her fur so long, who sat dozing in front of the fire, just opened an eye and went to sleep again. She had tried to get her nose into the milk jug, but it was too small, and the junket dish was too deep for her to reach, except with one paw. She didn't care much for bread and cheese and apple pudding, and was very well fed besides, so after just wandering round the table, she had jumped down from it again, and settled herself to sleep on the hearth. But Brownie had no notion of going to sleep. He wanted his supper, and oh, what a supper he did eat! First one thing and then another, and then trying everything all over again, and oh, what a lot he drank! First milk, and then cider, and then mixed the two together in a way that would have disagreed with anybody except a Brownie. As it was, he was obliged to slacken his belt several times, and at last took it off altogether. But he must have had a most extraordinary capacity for eating and drinking, since, after he had nearly cleared the table, he was just as lively as ever, and began jumping about on the table as if he had had no supper at all. Now, jumping was a little awkward, for there happened to be a clean white tablecloth. As this was only Monday, it had had no time to get dirty, untidy as the cook was. And you know Brownie lived in a coal-cellar, and his feet were black with running about in coal-dust, so wherever he trod he left the impression behind, until at last the whole tablecloth was covered with black marks. Not that he minded this, in fact. He took great pains to make the cloth as dirty as possible, and then, laughing loudly, ho, leaped onto the hearth, and began teasing the cat, squeaking like a mouse, or chirping like a cricket, or buzzing like a fly, and altogether disturbing poor Pussy's mind so much that she went and hid herself in the farthest corner, and left him the hearth all to himself, where he lay at ease till daybreak. Then, hearing a slight noise overhead, which might be the servants getting up, he jumped on to the table again, gobbled up the few remaining crumbs for his breakfast, and scampered off to his coal-cellar, where he hid himself under his big coal and fell asleep for the day. Well, the cook came downstairs rather earlier than usual, for she remembered she had to clear off the remains of supper, but lo and behold, there was nothing left to clear. Every bit of food was eaten up. The cheese looked as if a dozen mice had been nibbling at it, and nibbled it down to the very rind. The milk and cider were all drunk, and mice didn't care for milk and cider, you know. As for the apple pudding, it had vanished altogether, and the dish was licked as clean as if Boxer the yard dog had been at it in his hungriest mood. And my white tablecloth! Oh, my clean white tablecloth! What can have been done to it? cried she in amazement, for it was all over, little black footmarks just the size of a baby's foot, only babies didn't wear shoes with nails in them, and don't run about and climb on kitchen tables after all the family have gone to bed. Cook was a little frightened, but her fright changed to anger when she saw the large black cat stretched comfortably on the hearth. Poor Muff had crept there for a little snooze after Brownie went away. "You nasty cat! I see it all now. It's you that have eaten up all the supper. It's you that have been on my clean tablecloth with your dirty paws." They were white paws, and as clean as possible, but Cook never thought of that, any more than she did of the fact that cats don't usually drink cider or eat apple pudding. "I'll teach you to come stealing food in this way. Take that, and that, and that!" Cook got hold of a broom and beat poor Pussy till the creature ran mewing away. She couldn't speak, you know, unfortunate cat, and tell people that it was Brownie who had done it all. Next night, Cook thought she would make all safe and sure, so instead of letting the cat sleep by the fire, she shut her up in the chilly coal cellar, locked the door, put the key in her pocket, and went off to bed, leaving the supper as before. When Brownie woke up and looked out of his hole, there was as usual no supper for him, and the cellar was close shut. He peered about to try and find some cranny under the door to creep out at, but there was none, and he felt so hungry that he could almost have eaten the cat, who kept walking to and fro in a melancholy manner, only she was alive, and he couldn't well eat her alive. Besides, he knew she was old, and had an idea she might be tough, so he merely said politely, "How do you do, Miss Pussy?" To which she answered nothing, of course. Something must be done, and luckily brownies can do things which nobody else can do. So he thought he would change himself into a mouse, and gnaw a hole through the door, but then he suddenly remembered the cat, who, though he had decided not to eat her, might take this opportunity of eating him. So he thought it advisable to wait till she was fast asleep, which did not happen for a good while. At length, quite tired with walking about, Pussy turned around on her tail 6 times, curled down in the corner, and fell fast asleep. Immediately Brownie changed himself into the smallest mouse possible, and, taking care not to make the least noise, gnawed a hole in the door, and squeezed himself through, immediately turning into his proper shape again for fear of accidents. The kitchen fire was at its last glimmer, but showed a better supper than even last night, for the cook had had friends with her, a brother and 2 cousins, and they had been exceedingly merry. The food they had left behind was enough for 3 brownies at least, but this one managed to eat it all up. Only once, in trying to cut a great slice of beef, he let the carving knife and fork fall with such a clatter that Tiny the terrier, who was tied up at the foot of the stairs, began to bark furiously. However, he brought her puppy, which had been left in a basket in the corner of the kitchen, and so succeeded in quieting her. After that he enjoyed himself amazingly, and made more marks than ever on the white tablecloth, for he began jumping around like a pea on a trencher, in order to make his particularly large supper agree with him. Then, in the absence of the cat, he teased the puppy for an hour or 2, till, hearing the clock strike 5, he thought it was as well to turn into a mouse again, and creep back cautiously into his cellar. He was only just in time, for Muff opened one eye, and was just going to pounce upon him, when he changed himself back into a brownie. She was so startled that she bounded away, her tail growing into twice its natural size, and her eyes gleaming like round green globes. But Brownie only said, "Ha ha ho!" and walked deliberately into his hole. When Cook came downstairs and saw that the same thing had happened again, that the supper was all eaten and the tablecloth blacker than ever with the extraordinary footmarks, she was greatly puzzled. Who could have done it at all? Not the cat, who came mewing out of the coal cellar the minute she unlocked the door. Possibly a rat, but then would a rat have come within reach of Tiny? It must have been Tiny herself, or her puppy, which just came rolling out of its basket over to Cook's feet. "You little wretch! You and your mother are the greatest nuisance imaginable! I'll punish you!" Quite forgetting that Tiny had been safely tied up all night, and that her poor little puppy was so fat and helpless it could scarcely stand on its legs, to say nothing of jumping on the chairs and tables, she gave them both such a thrashing that they ran howling together out of the kitchen door, where the kind little kitchen maid took them up in her arms. "You ought to have beaten the Brownie, if you could catch him," she said in a whisper. "He'll do it again and again, you'll see, for he can't bear an untidy kitchen. You'd better do as poor old cook did, and clear the supper things away, and put the odds and ends safe in the larder also," she added mysteriously. "If I were you, I'd put a bowl of milk behind the coal cellar door." "Nonsense!" answered the young cook, and flounced away. But afterwards she thought better of it, and did as she was advised, grumbling all the time, but doing it. Next morning the milk was gone. Perhaps Brownie had drunk it up. Anyhow, nobody could say that he hadn't. As for the supper, cook having safely laid it on the shelves of the larder, nobody touched it, and the tablecloth, which was wrapped up tidily and put in the dresser drawer, came out as clean as ever, with not a single black footmark upon it. No mischief being done, the cat and the dog both escaped beating, and Brownie played no more tricks with anybody till the next time. End of adventure. Recorded by Ankila. Adventure the Second of the Adventures of a Brownie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ankila. Adventures of a Brownie, as Told to My Child, by Miss Mulock. Adventure the Second, Brownie and the Cherry Tree. The next time was quick in coming, which was not wonderful, considering there was a Brownie in the house. Otherwise, the house was like most other houses, and the family like most other families. The children also. They were sometimes good, sometimes naughty, like other children. But, on the whole, they deserved to have the pleasure of a Brownie to play with them, as they declared he did many and many a time. A favorite play place was the orchard, where grew the biggest cherry tree you ever saw. They called it their castle, because it rose up 10 feet from the ground in one thick stem, and then branched out into a circle of boughs, with a flat place in the middle, where 2 or 3 children could sit at once. There they often did sit, turn by turn, or one at a time, sometimes with a book, reading, and the biggest boy made a sort of rope ladder by which they could climb up and down, which they did all winter, and enjoyed their castle very much. But one day in spring they found their ladder cut away. The gardener had done it, saying it injured the tree, which was just coming into blossom. Now this gardener was a rather gruff man with a growling voice. He did not mean to be unkind, but he disliked children. He said they bothered him. But when they complained to their mother about the ladder, she agreed with Gardener that the tree must not be injured, as it bore the biggest cherries in all the neighborhood, so big that the old saying of taking 2 bites at a cherry came really true. "Wait till the cherries are ripe," she said. And so the little people waited, and watched it through its leafing and blossoming, such sheets of blossom, white as snow, till the fruit began to show, and grew large and red on every bough. At last one morning the mother said, "Children, should you like to help gather the cherries today?" "Hurrah!" they cried, "and not a day too soon, for we saw a flock of starlings in the next field, and if we don't clear the tree, they will." "Very well, clear it then. Only mind and fill my basket quite full for preserving. What is over you may eat if you like." "Thank you, thank you!" And the children were eager to be off, but the mother stopped them till she could get the gardener and his ladder. "For it is he must climb the tree, not you, and you must do exactly as he tells you, and he will stop with you all the time and see that you don't come to harm." This was no slight cloud on the children's happiness, and they begged hard to go alone. "Please, might we? We will be so good." The mother shook her head. All the goodness in the world would not help them if they tumbled off the tree, or eat themselves sick with cherries. "You would not be safe, and I should be so unhappy." To make mother unhappy was the worst rebuke possible to these children. So they choked down their disappointment, and followed the gardener as he walked on ahead, carrying his ladder on his shoulder. He looked very cross, and as if he did not like the children's company at all. They were pretty good on the whole, though they chattered a good deal, but Gardener said not a word to them all the way to the orchard. When they reached it, he just told them to keep out of his way and not worrit him. which they politely promised, saying among themselves that they should not enjoy their cherry gathering at all. But children who make the best of things and try to be as good as they can sometimes have fun unawares. When the gardener was steadying his ladder against the trunk of the cherry tree, there was suddenly heard the barking of a dog, a very fierce dog too. First it seemed close beside them, in the flower garden, then in the fowl yard. Gardner dropped the ladder out of his hands. "It's that Boxer! He has got loose again! He will be running after my chickens and dragging his broken chain all over my borders. And he is so fierce and so delighted to get free, he'll bite anybody who ties him up except me." "Hadn't you better go and see after him?" Gardner thought it was the eldest boy who spoke, and turned round angrily, but the little fellow had never opened his lips. Here there was heard a still louder bark, and from a quite different part of the garden. "There he is, I'm sure of it, jumping over my bedding out plants and breaking my cucumber frames. Abominable beast! Just let me catch him." Off Gardner darted in a violent passion, throwing the ladder down upon the grass, and forgetting all about the cherries and the children. The instant he was gone, a shrill laugh, loud and merry, was heard close by, and a little brown old man's face peeped from behind the cherry tree.
"How do ye? Boxer was me, didn't I, Barkwell? Now I'm come to play with you."
The children clapped their hands, for they knew they were going to have some fun if Brownie was there. He was the best little playfellow in the world, and then they had him all to themselves. Nobody ever saw him except the children.
"Come on!"
cried he in his shrill little voice, half like an old man's, half like a baby's.
"Who'll begin to gather the cherries?"
They all looked blank, for the tree was so high to where the branches sprung, and besides, their mother had said they were not to climb, and the ladder lay flat upon the grass, far too heavy for little hands to move.
"What? You big boys don't expect a poor little fellow like me to lift the ladder all by myself. Try, I'll help you."
Whether he helped or not, no sooner had they taken hold of the ladder than it rose up almost of its own accord, and fixed itself quite safely against the tree. "But we must not climb, Mother told us not," said the boys ruefully. "Mother said we were to stand at the bottom and pick up the cherries."
"Very well, obey your mother. I'll just run up the tree myself."
Before the words were out of his mouth, Brownie had darted up the ladder like a monkey and disappeared among the fruit-laden branches. The children looked dismayed for a moment, till they saw a merry brown face peeping out from the green leaves at the very top of the tree.
"Biggest fruit always grows highest," cried the Brownie. "Stand in a row, all you children. Little boys, hold out your caps. Little girls, make a bag of your pinafores. Open your mouths and shut your eyes and see what the Queen will send you."
They laughed and did as they were told, whereupon they were drowned in a shower of cherries, cherries falling like hailstones, hitting them on their heads, their cheeks, their noses, filling their caps and pinafores, then rolling and tumbling onto the grass, till it was strewn thick as leaves in autumn with the rosy fruit. What a glorious scramble they had, these 3 little boys and 3 little girls! How they laughed and jumped and knocked heads together in picking up the cherries, yet never quarrelled, for there were such heaps it would have been ridiculous to squabble over them. And besides, whenever they began to quarrel, Brownie always ran away. Now he was the merriest of the lot, ran up and down the tree like a cat, helping to pick up the cherries, and was first rate at filling the large market basket. "We were to eat as many as we liked, only we must first fill the basket," conscientiously said the eldest girl, upon which they all set to at once, and filled it to the brim.
"Now we'll have a dinner party,"
cried the Brownie, and squatted down like a Turk, crossing his queer little legs and sticking his elbows upon his knees in a way that nobody but a Brownie could manage.
Sit in a ring, and we'll see who can eat the fastest."
The children obeyed. How many cherries they devoured, and how fast they did it, passes my capacity of telling. I only hope that they were not ill the next day, and that all the cherry stones they swallowed by mistake did not disagree with them. But perhaps nothing does disagree with one when one dines with a Brownie. They ate so much, laughing in equal proportion, that they had quite forgotten the gardener, when they heard him clicking angrily the orchard gate, and talking to himself as he walked through. "That nasty dog hunted him, I thought, from one end of the garden to the other. Now for the cherries and the children. Bless us! Where are the children? And the cherries? Why, the tree is as bare as a blackthorn in February. The starlings have been at it after all. Oh dear, oh dear!" Oh dear!" echoed a voice from behind the tree, followed by shouts of mocking laughter. Not from the children. They sat as demure as possible, all in a ring, with their hands before them, and, in the center, the huge basket of cherries, piled as full as it could possibly hold. But the brownie had disappeared. "You naughty brats! I'll have you punished!" cried the gardener, furious at the laughter, for he never laughed himself. But as there was nothing wrong, the cherries being gathered, a very large crop, and the ladder found safe in its place, it was difficult to say what had been the harm done, and who had done it. So he went growling back to the house, carrying the cherries to the mistress, who coaxed him into good temper again, as she sometimes did, bidding also the children to behave well to him, since he was an old man, and not really bad, only cross. As for the little folks, she had not the slightest intention of punishing them. And as for Brownie, it was impossible to catch him, so nobody was punished at all. End of adventure. Recorded by Ankila.
Adventure the Third of Adventures of a Brownie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Nugent. Adventures of a Brownie by Miss Mulock. Adventure the Third. Brownie in the Farmyard. Which was a place where he did not often go, for he preferred being warm and snug in the house. But when he felt himself ill-used, he would wander anywhere in order to play tricks upon those whom he thought had done him harm. For being only a brownie and not a man, he did not understand that the best way to revenge yourself upon your enemies is either to let them alone or to pay them back good for evil. It disappoints them so much and makes them so exceedingly ashamed of themselves. One day, Brownie overheard the gardener advising the cook to put sour milk into his bowl at night instead of sweet. He'd never find out the difference, no more than the pigs do. Indeed, it's my belief that the pig or dog or something empties the bowl and not the brownie at all. It's just clean waste, that's what I say. Then you'd better hold your tongue and mind your own business, returned the cook, who was a sharp temper, and would not stand being meddled with. She began to abuse the gardener soundly, but his wife, who was standing by, took his part, as she always did when any third party scolded him. So they all squabbled together till Brownie hid under his collar, put his little hands over his little ears. Dear me, what a noise these mortals do make when they quarrel! They quite deafen me. I must teach them better manners. But when the cook slammed the door to, and left Gardner and his wife alone, they too began to dispute between themselves. You make such a fuss over your nasty pigs, and get all the scraps for them, said the wife. It's of much more importance that I should have everything cooked and spare for my chickens. Never were such fine chickens as my last brood. I thought they were ducklings. How you catch me up, you rude old man! They are ducklings, and beauties too, even though they have never seen water. Where's the pond you promised to make for me, I wonder? Rubbish, woman! If my cows do without a pond, your ducklings may. And why will you be so silly as to rear ducklings at all? Fine fat chickens are a deal better. You'll find out your mistake some day. And so will you, when that old orangery runs dry. You'll wish you had taken my advice and fattened and sold her. Ordinary cows will sell for fattening, and women's advice is never worth twopence. Yours isn't worth even a halfpenny. What are you laughing at? "I wasn't laughing," said the wife angrily, and in truth it was not she, but little Brownie, running under the barrow, which the gardener was wheeling along, and very much amused that people would be so silly as to squabble about nothing. It was still early morning, for whatever this old couple's faults might be, laziness was not one of them. The wife rose with the dawn to feed her poultry and collect her eggs. The husband also got through as much work by breakfast time as many an idle man does by noon. But Brownie had been beforehand with them this day. When all the fowls came running to be fed, the big Brahma hen who had hatched the duckling was seen wandering forlornly about and clucking mournfully for her young brood. She could not find them anywhere. Had she been able to speak, she might have told how a large white Aylesbury duck had waddled into the farmyard and waddled out again, coaxing them after her, no doubt in search of a pond. But missing they were, most certainly. "Cluck, cluck, cluck!" moaned the miserable hen mother, and "Oh, my ducklings, my ducklings!" cried the gardener's wife. "Who can have carried off my beautiful ducklings?" "Rats, maybe," said the gardener cruelly, as he walked away, and as he went he heard the squeak of a rat below his wheelbarrow. But he could not catch it, any more than his wife could catch the Aylesbury duck. Of course not. Both were the Brownie. Just at this moment, the 6 little people came running into the farmyard. When they had been particularly good, they were sometimes allowed to go with the gardener a-milking, each carrying his or her own mug for a drink of milk warm from the cow. They scampered after him, a noisy tribe, begging to be taken down to the field and holding out their 6 mugs entreatingly. "What, 6 cupfuls of milk, when I haven't got a drop to spare, and cook is always wanting more? Ridiculous nonsense! Get along with you. You may come to the field, I can't hinder that, but you will get no milk this day. Take your mugs back again to the kitchen." The poor little fox made the best of a bad business and obeyed, then followed Gardner down to the field rather dolefully. But it was such a beautiful morning that they soon recovered their spirits. The grass shone with dew like a sheet of diamonds, the clovers smelled so sweet, and the 2 skylarks were singing at one another high up in the sky. Several rabbits darted past to their great amusement, especially one a very large rabbit, brown, not grey, which dodged them in and out, and once nearly threw Gardner down, pail and all, by running across his feet, which set them all laughing till they came where Dolly the cow lay, chewing the cud under a large oak tree. It was great fun to stir her up, as usual, and lie down, one after the other, in the place where she had lain all night long, making the grass flat and warm and perfumy with her sweet breath. She let them do it, and then stood meekly by, for Dolly was the gentlest cow in the world. But this morning something strange seemed to possess her. She altogether refused to be milked, kicked, plunged, tossed over the pail, which was luckily empty. "Bless the cow! What's wrong with her? It's surely you children's fault. Stand up, the whole lot of you. So, Dolly, good Dolly." But Dolly was anything but good. She stood switching her tail, and looking as savage as so mild an animal possibly could look. "It's all your doing, you naughty children. You've been playing her some trick, I know," cried the gardener in great wrath. They assured him they had done nothing, and indeed they looked as quiet as mice and as innocent as lambs. At length the biggest boy pointed out a large wasp which had settled in Dolly's ear. "That accounts for everything," said the gardener. But it did not mean everything, for when he tried to drive it away, it kept coming back, and buzzing round his own head and the cow's, with a voice that the children thought was less like the buzz of a wasp than the sound of a person laughing. At length it frightened Dolly to such an extent that with one wide bound she darted right away and galloped off to the further end of the field. "I'll get a rope and tie her legs together," cried the gardener fiercely. "She shall repent giving me all this trouble, that she shall." "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed somebody. The gardener thought it was the children, and gave one of them an angry cough as he walked away. But they knew it was somebody else, and were not at all surprised when, the minute his back was turned, Dolly came walking quietly back, led by a little wee brown man who scarcely reached up to her knees. Yet she let him guide her, which he did as gently as possible, though the string he held her by was no thicker than a spider web floating from one of her horns. "So, Dolly, good Dolly," cried Brownie, mimicking the gardener's voice. "Now we shall see what we can do. I want my breakfast badly, don't you, little folks?" Of course they did, for the morning air made them very hungry. "Very well, wait a bit though. Old people should be served first, you know. Besides, I want to go to bed." "Go to bed in the daylight?" The children all laughed, and then looked quite shy and sorry, lest they might have seemed rude to the little Brownie. But he liked fun, and never took offence when none was meant. He placed himself on the milking stool, which was so high that his little leg was dangling halfway down, and milked and milked. Dolly standing as still as possible till he had filled the whole pail. Most astonishing cow! She gave as much as 2 cows, and such delicious milk as it was, all frothing and yellow, richer than even Dolly's milk had ever been before. The children's mouth watered for it, but not a word said they, even when, instead of giving it to them, Brownie put his own mouth into the pail and drank, till it seemed as if they were never going to stop. But it was decidedly a relief to them when he popped his head up again, and lo! the pail was as full as ever. "Now, little ones, now's your turn. Where are your mugs?" All answered mournfully, "We've got none. Gardener made us take them back again." "Never mind, all right. Gather me half a dozen of the biggest buttercups you can find." What nonsense, thought the children, but they did it. Brownie laid the flowers in a row upon the eldest girl's lap, blew upon them one by one, and each turned into the most beautiful golden cup that ever was seen. "Now then, everyone take his own mug, and I'll fill it." He milked away. Each child got a drink, and then the cups were filled again. And all the while Dolly stood as quiet as possible, looking benignly round, as if she would be happy to supply milk to the whole parish, if the Brownie desired it. "So, Dolly, thank you, Dolly," said he again, mimicking the gardener's voice, half growling, half coaxing.
and while he spoke, the real voice was heard behind the hedge. There was a sound as of a great wasp flying away, which made Dolly prick up her ears and look as if the old savage knees were coming back upon her. The children snatched up their mugs, but there was no need. They had all turned into the buttercups again. Gardner jumped over the stile as cross as two sticks, with an old rope in his hand. "Oh, what a bother I've had! Breakfast ready, and no milk yet, and such a row as they are making over the lost ducklings! Stand back, you children, and don't hinder me a minute. No use begging, not a drop of milk shall you get. Hillo, Dolly! Quiet, old girl!" Quiet enough she was this time, but you might as well have milked a plaster cow in a London mill shop. Not one ringing drop resounded against the empty pail, for, when they peeped in, the children saw to their amazement that it was empty.
"The creature's bewitched!" cried the gardener in a great fury, "or else somebody has milked her dry already. Have you done it, or you?" he asked each of the children.
They might have said no, which was the literal truth, but then it would not have been the whole truth, for they knew quite well that Dolly had been milked, and also who had done it. And their mother had always taught them that to make a person believe a lie is nearly as bad as telling him one. Yet still they did not like to betray the kind little Brownie. Greatly puzzled, they hung their heads and said nothing. "Look in your pail again!" cried a voice from the other side of Dolly. And there, at the bottom, was just the usual quantity of milk, no more and no less. The gardener was very much astonished. "It must be the Brownie," muttered he in a frightened tone, and taking off his hat, "Thank you, sir," said he to Mr. Nobody, at which the children all burst out laughing. But they kept their own counsel, and he was afraid to ask them any more questions. By and by his fright wore off a little. "I only hope the milk is good milk, and will poison nobody," said he sulkily. "However, that's not my affair. You children had better tell your mother all about it. I left her in the farmyard in a pretty state of mind about her ducklings." Perhaps Brownie heard this and was sorry, for he liked the children's mother, who had always been kind to him. Besides, he never did anybody harm who did not deserve it, and though, being a Brownie, he could hardly be said to have a conscience, he had something which stood in the place of one, a liking to see people happy rather than miserable. So instead of going to bed under his call for the day, when, after breakfast, the children and their mother came out to look at the new brood of chickens, he crept after them and hid behind the hen coop where the old mother was put with her young ones around her. There had been great difficulty in getting her in there, for she was a hen who hatched her brood on independent principles. Instead of sitting upon the nice nest that the gardener made for her, she had twice gone into the little wood close by and made a nest for herself which nobody could ever find, and where she hatched in secret, coming every second day to be fed, and then vanishing again, till at last she reappeared in triumph, with her chickens running after her. The first brood there had been 12, but of these there were 14, all from her own eggs, of course, and she was uncommonly proud of them. So was the gardener, so was the mistress, who liked all young things. Such a picture as they were, 14 soft, yellow, fluffy things running about after their mother. It had been a most troublesome business to catch, first her and then them, to put them under the coop. The old hen resisted and pecked furiously at Gardner's legs, and the children ran about in frantic terror, chirping wildly in answer to her clucking. At last, however, the little family was safe in shelter, and the chickens counted over to see that none had been lost in scuffle. How funny they were, looking so innocent and yet so wise, as chickens do, peering out of the world from under their mother's wing, or hopping over her back, or snuggled all together under her breast, so that nothing was seen out of them but a mass of yellow legs like a great centipede. "How happy the old hen is!" said the children's mother, looking on, and then looking compassionately at the other forlorn old hen who had hatched the ducklings, and kept wandering about the farmyard, clucking miserably. "Those poor ducklings! What can have become of them? If rats have killed them, we should have found feathers or something, and weasels would have sucked their brains and left them. They must have been stolen, or wandered away, and died of cold and hunger. My poor ducklings!" The mistress sighed, for she could not bear any living thing to suffer, and the children nearly cried at the thought of what might be happening to their pretty ducklings. That very minute a little wee brown face peered through a hole in the hen coop, making the old mother hen fly furiously at it, as she did at the slightest shadow of an enemy to her little ones. However, no harm happened. Only a guinea fowl suddenly ran across the farmyard, screaming in its usual harsh voice. But it was not the usual sort of guinea fowl, being larger and handsomer than any of theirs. "Oh, what a beauty of a creature! How did it ever come into our farmyard?" cried the delighted children, and started off after it, to catch it if possible. But they ran and ran through the gate, and out into the lane, and the guinea fowl still ran on before them, until turning round a corner they lost sight of it, and immediately saw something else equally curious. Sitting on top of a big thistle, so big that he must have had to climb it just like a tree, was the Brownie. His legs were crossed, and his arms too. His little brown cap was stuck knowingly on one side, and he was laughing heartily. "How do you do? Here I am again. I thought I wouldn't go to bed after all. Shall I help you to find the ducklings? Very well, come along."
They crossed the field, Brownie running beside them, and as fast as they could, though he looked such an old man, and sometimes turning over on legs and arms like a Catherine wheel, which they tried to imitate, but generally failed, and only bruised their fingers and noses. He led them on till they came to the wood, and to a green path in it, which, well as they knew the neighborhood, none of the children had ever seen before. It led to a most beautiful pond, as clear as crystal, and as blue as the sky. Large trees grew round it, dipping their branches in the water, as if they were looking at themselves in a glass. And all about their roots were quantity of primroses, the biggest primroses the little girl had ever seen. Down they dropped on their fat knees, squashing down more primroses than they gathered, though they tried to gather them all, and the smallest child even began to cry because her hands were so full that the flowers dropped through her fingers. But the boys, older and more practical, rather despised primroses. "I thought we had come to look for ducklings," said the eldest. "Mother is fretting dreadfully about her ducklings. Where can they be?" "Shut your eyes and you will see," said the Brownie, at which they all laughed, but did it. And when they opened their eyes again, what should they behold but a whole fleet of ducklings sailing out from the roots of an old willow tree, one after the other, looking as fat and content as possible, and swimming as naturally as if they had lived on a pond, and this particular pond, all their days. "Count them," said the Brownie, "the whole 8, quite correct, and try to catch them if you can." Easier said than done. The boys set to work with great satisfaction. Boys do so enjoy hunting something. They coaxed them, they shouted at them, they threw little sticks at them. But as soon as they wanted them to go one way, the fleet of ducklings immediately turned round and sailed another way, doing so deliberately and majestically that the children could not help laughing. As for little Brownie, he sat on a branch of a willow tree, with his legs dangling down to the surface of the pond, kicking at the water spiders and grinning with all his might. At length, quite tired out, in spite of their fun, the children begged for his help, and he took compassion on them. "Turn round 3 times and see what you can find," shouted he. Immediately each little boy found in his arms, and each little girl in her pinafore, a fine fat duckling. And there being 8 of them, the 2 elder children had each a couple. They were rather cold and damp, and slightly uncomfortable to cuddle, ducks not being used to cuddling. Poor things! They struggled hard to get away, but the children hugged them tight, and ran as fast as their legs could carry them through the wood, forgetting in their joy even to say thank you to the little Brownie. When they reached their mother, she was as glad as they, for she never thought to see her ducklings again, and to have them back all alive and uninjured, and watch them running into the old hen, who received them with an ecstasy of delight, was so exciting that nobody thought of asking a single question as to where they had been found. When the mother did ask, the children told her all about Brownie's taking them into a beautiful pond, and what a wonderful pond it was, how green the trees were round it, and how large the primroses grew. They never tired of talking about it and seeking for it. But the odd thing was that, seek as they might, they never could find it again. Many a day did the little people roam about, one by one or all together, round the wood, and across the wood, and up and down the wood, often getting themselves sadly draggled with mud and torn with brambles. But the beautiful pond they never found again. Nor did the ducklings, I suppose, for they wandered no more from the farmyard, to the old mother hen's great content. They grew up into fat and respectable ducks, 5 white ones and 3 grey ones, waddling about, very content, though they never saw water except the tank which was placed for them to paddle in. They lived a lazy, peaceful, pleasant life for a long time, and were at last killed and eaten with green peas, one after the other, to the family's great satisfaction, if not to their own. End of Adventure the Third.